David's lungs burned as he gasped for air. The stifling darkness pressed in from every side. His hands trembled as he reached out, only to feel the unyielding wood of a coffin enclosing him. Panic set in. Where am I? Is this my funeral? His voice cracked, hoarse and weak. Just as terror threatened to consume him, familiar voices pierced the silence outside. He froze, ears straining. "I thought this day would never come," a woman said, her tone triumphant. It was Clara, his wife. Her words hit like a dagger. His wife. What was she doing outside his coffin, sounding anything but mournful? "All that's left is to enjoy the wealth he left behind," she continued, her tone dripping with glee. Another voice joined hers, smooth and condescending. "You nearly failed, Clara. That bridge accident should have been the end of him." David's mind raced. Clara? An accomplice? Betrayal wrapped its icy fingers around his heart as realization dawned. The near misses, the car swerving toward him, the rickety ladder that almost gave way, none of it was coincidence. As Clara's accomplice chuckled softly, David's nails dug into the coffin lining. His rage burned brighter than his fear. Hello, wonderful viewers of Shadow Truth. We hope your day is going wonderfully. If you're enjoying our stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you more exciting and emotional content. Thank you. Years earlier, David had been smitten the moment he saw Clara. She was radiant, with striking red hair and a charm that lit up any room. To him, she was perfect. A muse, a partner, a reason to dream bigger. He didn't know then that her beauty concealed a heart filled with hatred. "She came to me like an angel," David had once told his best friend Edric. "I was so lucky." But Clara's angelic facade hid her darker motives. Behind her smiles was a lifetime of scars, scars inflicted by David's father. Ralph, a powerful and ruthless man, had preyed on Clara when she was young. Clara vowed vengeance the moment she discovered David was his son. Her plan was simple: seduce him, marry him, and ruin him. It began innocently enough, with casual meetings and shared laughter. She learned his habits, his weaknesses, and most importantly, his heart. David, blinded by love, missed the small cracks in her story, her sudden shifts in mood, her questions about his father, her reluctance to meet his family. The night they got engaged, Clara had seemed nervous. "Are you sure you want to be with me?" she asked, her eyes glistening with feigned vulnerability. "Of course, Clara," David replied, holding her hands tightly. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." What he didn't know was that her heart was racing for a different reason. Not out of love, but the fear that her hatred might slip through her mask too soon. Months into their marriage, Clara began laying the groundwork for her ultimate betrayal. She engineered small accidents, always making them seem like bad luck. A car nearly hit David one night. A heavy beam fell inches away from him at work. When David expressed his concerns, Clara played the role of the loving wife to perfection. "It's just a string of bad luck," she said soothingly. "Don't stress yourself, love." But David's subconscious began to whisper doubts. Why was it always him? Why did these incidents feel so deliberate? Edric noticed the strain on his friend. "David, you've been looking tired," he remarked one evening. "Is everything okay at home?" David hesitated, brushing it off with a forced smile. "Just work stress. Clara's been amazing, though. Amazing." That word gnawed at him as he tried to sleep that night. Could it be? No, not Clara. Not the woman he loved. Little did he know Clara was already planning the next step of her scheme, a poison-laced glass of wine and a perfectly staged accident. David sat across from Clara, their wine glasses catching the soft glow of the chandelier. Clara's eyes sparkled as she raised her glass. "To us," she said, her smile warm and inviting. David, relieved by her seemingly renewed affection, clinked his glass against hers. He had missed this version of her, the Clara who had stolen his heart. "I missed you," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't shown in weeks. Clara tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "And I've missed us," she replied. But inside, her mind churned with the dark satisfaction of knowing this would be their last shared drink. Unbeknownst to David, the wine in his glass was laced with poison, a carefully chosen dose meant to induce a fatal heart attack. Clara had rehearsed every detail. She would cry for help, but not too quickly. The medics would arrive too late, and David's death would be ruled natural. David finished his glass, setting it down with a satisfied sigh. "This is nice, Clara. I feel like we're finally getting back to how we used to be." Clara leaned forward, her fingers grazing his hand. "I hope so, love. You deserve peace." But within minutes, David's vision blurred. His limbs grew heavy, his breath shallow. "Clara, I don't feel so good," he muttered, trying to stand but collapsing back onto the couch. "Oh no!" Clara exclaimed, feigning panic as she knelt beside him. "David, hold on!" She held his face, watching his consciousness slip away. "Sweet dreams, my love," she whispered coldly before dialing emergency services, her tears falling on cue. By the time paramedics arrived, David was unresponsive. The declaration of death was swift, the scene clean, just as Clara had planned. When David woke in the darkness of the coffin, his body refused to move. Every breath was a struggle, every thought a war against despair. But the voices outside fueled his determination. Clara's tone was sharp. "It's done. David's buried, and soon enough, his company will be ours." James chuckled nervously. "Ours? You mean yours?" Clara shot him a glare. "Don't get greedy. Remember, I hold all the cards." Inside the coffin, David's fingers twitched. The paralysis was wearing off. Summoning every ounce of willpower, he scraped his fingernails against the coffin's interior, creating a faint, desperate sound. Meanwhile, at the cemetery, gravedigger Benjamin stood with his niece Gwen. They watched as Clara and James drove off, leaving behind the freshly buried coffin. "Strange people," Benjamin muttered, shaking his head. "Something feels off," Gwen replied, her gaze fixed on the grave. Teddy, Benjamin's loyal dog, barked and pawed at the ground near the grave. Gwen frowned, crouching beside the restless dog. "Uncle Ben, listen!" she exclaimed. A faint scratching noise emanated from the earth. Benjamin's face paled as he leaned closer. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Get the shovels!" Gwen shouted, adrenaline coursing through her veins. They worked feverishly, the sound growing louder as they dug. Finally, the coffin was unearthed. Benjamin pried it open, his hands trembling. Inside lay David, pale and gasping for air. "My God!" Gwen cried. "He's alive!" David's eyes fluttered open, locking onto Gwen's face. His voice was barely audible. "Don't tell her," he rasped. "Shh, you're safe now," Gwen reassured him, tears streaming down her face. At the hospital, Gwen sat by David's bedside as he clung to life. "Who did this to you?" she asked softly. David hesitated, his voice weak but resolute. "My wife. She tried to kill me." Gwen's eyes widened. "Your wife? Why?" "Revenge," David whispered, his throat burning. "Her hatred runs deeper than I ever knew." Gwen leaned in, her tone gentle but firm. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this." Over the following days, Gwen and Benjamin pieced together the truth. David shared everything he remembered, from Clara's sudden coldness to her cryptic remarks. "She must think I'm dead," David murmured, his strength slowly returning. "That's my advantage." "And what will you do?" Gwen asked, her concern evident. David's gaze hardened. "I'll make her pay, but I'll need help." Gwen nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "You've got mine." Together they began to plan, knowing that exposing Clara's treachery would take cunning and courage. The battle for justice had only just begun. In the days following his recovery, David became consumed by one thought: exposing Clara. But to do so, He needed allies who would believe his story and help him fight back. He turned to the only person he could trust completely, Edric. "David!" Edric's voice trembled with disbelief as he saw his best friend, alive and standing before him. I thought you were dead." "I almost was," David said grimly, gripping Edric's shoulder. "Clara did this to me. She poisoned me and buried me alive." Edric's face turned pale. "Clara, are you sure? That's monstrous." David nodded, his voice filled with quiet rage. "She's been plotting this for years, and she didn't do it alone. James was in on it." Edric's eyes darkened. "We'll bring them both down, whatever it takes." Together they began gathering evidence. Edric pulled records from the company, highlighting suspicious transactions that Clara had authorized. Meanwhile, Gwen worked tirelessly to recall every detail of Clara's behavior at the funeral. She was too calm, Gwen told them during a late-night meeting. Her tears felt rehearsed, and that man with her, James, he kept glancing around like he was nervous. "Classic signs of guilt," Edric muttered. David clenched his fists. "It's not enough. We need her to confess." Edric leaned forward, a determined glint in his eye. "Then we'll set a trap." David, Edric, and Gwen devised a plan to lure Clara into revealing her crimes. They crafted a story. A mysterious person had discovered David's death wasn't as clean as it seemed. This person demanded money in exchange for silence, threatening to expose Clara and James. The bait was delivered via a phone call from Gwen. Her voice was calm but commanding. "Clara," Gwen said, "I know what you did to your husband. Meet me tomorrow, or this goes public." "What are you talking about?" Clara hissed, her voice sharp with panic. "You know exactly what I mean. Bring James or you'll both regret it." The line went dead, leaving Clara seething. She had no choice but to meet her blackmailer. The next evening, Clara and James arrived at the abandoned house where the meeting was set. Clara's face was a mask of anger, but fear flickered in her eyes. "This is a setup," James muttered as they approached the door. "Shut up," Clara snapped. "If it is, I'll handle it." Inside, Gwen greeted them with a cold smile. "Took you long enough." Clara crossed her arms. "What do you want?" Gwen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured to a chair. "Sit down, both of you." James hesitated, but Clara dragged him forward. "Get to the point," she demanded. Gwen leaned forward, her voice low and deliberate. "I know you poisoned David. I know you buried him alive. And I know why." Clara's composure cracked. "You don't know anything." "Oh, but I do," Gwen replied smoothly. "You hated David's father, didn't you? Ralph, the man who hurt you. This wasn't about money. It was about revenge." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Who told you that?" "It doesn't matter," Gwen said, shrugging. "What matters is how this ends. If you don't confess, I'll take everything I have to the police." "You're bluffing," Clara said, her voice wavering. "Am I?" Gwen smirked. The silence stretched until Clara snapped. "Fine. Yes, I hated Ralph. He destroyed my life, and David was just another tool for me to get back at him." "Clara!" James exclaimed, panic flooding his face. "Shut up!" Clara shouted. "It's over anyway. They know everything." Before she could say more, the door burst open. Edric stepped in, flanked by 2 police officers. "Clara Danvers, you're under arrest," one officer announced. Clara's face twisted in fury. "You set me up," she screamed at Gwen. "No," Gwen replied, her voice steady. "You set yourself up the moment you decided to betray the man who loved you." As Clara and James were handcuffed and led away, David emerged from the shadows. His eyes locked on Clara's, filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "You could have told me the truth," he said quietly. "I would have helped you." Clara didn't respond. She turned away, her once confident demeanor shattered. David turned to Gwen and Edric, gratitude softening his features. "Thank you, both of you. I couldn't have done this without you." Gwen smiled warmly. "You deserved the truth, David. And now, you can finally move on." The courtroom was packed. Clara sat at the defendant's table, her once confident demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. Beside her, James avoided eye contact with everyone, knowing his role in the scheme had sealed his fate. David watched from the plaintiff's side, his expression calm but resolute. Gwen sat beside him, offering quiet support. Edric stood nearby, his arms crossed, exuding silent determination. As the prosecutor laid out the evidence, the atmosphere grew tense. Recordings of Clara's confession and the documentation of her financial manipulations were irrefutable. The jury shifted uncomfortably as Clara's motives were revealed. "Mrs. Danvers," the prosecutor said, his voice cutting through the silence, "you orchestrated the poisoning and burial of your husband. Do you deny it?" Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't mean for it to happen that way," she muttered. "Didn't mean for it to happen?" the prosecutor repeated sharply. "You planned every detail, even ensuring Mr. Danvers couldn't escape his coffin." The room erupted in murmurs. Clara's lawyer attempted to object, but it was futile. The evidence spoke for itself. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Clara's gaze met his one last time before she was led away. There was no apology in her eyes, only regret for being caught. James received a similar sentence, though his role was less central. The two conspirators would no longer pose a threat to David's life or legacy. Outside the courtroom, David turned to Gwen and Edric. "It's over," he said, his voice filled with quiet relief. "You can finally move forward," Gwen replied, her smile warm and encouraging. Months passed, and the scars Clara left on David's life began to heal. With Edric managing the company and Gwen by his side, David found himself rediscovering life's simple joys. One day, Gwen invited him to the orphanage where she volunteered. "I think you'll find some peace there," she said. David hesitated but agreed. The children greeted them with bright smiles, their laughter echoing through the hallways. Gwen introduced him to Otto, a 10-year-old boy with a mischievous grin and an unshakable curiosity. "Uncle David, are you going to play with us?" Otto asked, tugging on his hand. David chuckled. "Of course. What are we playing?" By the end of the day, David felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. Watching Gwen interact with the children, he saw a kindness and strength that had become a beacon in his life. As they left, David turned to her. "Thank you for bringing me here. It's humbling." Gwen smiled. "Sometimes helping others is the best way to heal yourself." Inspired, David began investing in the orphanage. He funded educational programs and expanded their facilities. The children became a new source of purpose for him, their resilience reminding him of his own. One quiet evening, David invited Gwen for dinner. Over candlelight, he reached across the table to take her hand. "You've done so much for me, Gwen," he said, his voice earnest. "I don't think I'd have made it without you." "You're stronger than you think, David," she replied softly. David hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small velvet box. "I don't want to waste another moment," he said, his voice steady. "You've given me a reason to hope again. Will you let me be part of your life? Permanently?" Gwen's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. Their wedding was simple, held in the orphanage's courtyard. The children were their guests, laughing and cheering as David and Gwen exchanged vows. For the first time in years, David felt whole. As the evening ended, David watched Gwen play with the children. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from betrayal and despair to love and hope. He knew life would always have its challenges, but with Gwen by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. "Let's go home," Gwen said, taking his hand. David smiled. Home sounds perfect. David's journey from betrayal to redemption is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He faced unimaginable darkness, both literal and metaphorical, but emerged stronger, with a newfound purpose and love. Gwen's compassion and strength were the light that guided him, proving that even in the bleakest moments, There's always hope when people stand by one another. This story is more than just about revenge and justice. It's about the power of second chances. David learned not only to rebuild his life, but also to open his heart to helping others. The orphanage became his sanctuary, and his bond with Gwen blossomed into a partnership built on trust and shared values. Now, it's your turn. What do you think about this story? If you were David, could you have found the strength to fight back? What about Gwen's role? How important do you think compassion and determination are in overcoming life's challenges? If you were to rate this story, what score would you give it? We'd love to hear your thoughts and insights. Your feedback is invaluable in helping us create even more meaningful and engaging content. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more gripping stories like this one. Sharing your opinions helps us grow and bring you even better experiences. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. We hope this story inspired you and reminded you of the strength we all have within. Wishing you a wonderful day filled with hope, resilience, and positivity. See you in the next story.